Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. We want to make sure we have time for this great conversation. Today, we're talking about tenure in higher education, and I'm Mimi Chapman. I'm one of the co-founders of the Coalition for Carolina. I'm a professor in the School of Social Work, and tenure is an important part of the higher education landscape, but it's something that many people, both on campus and off, don't always really understand. In recent years, public officials have made statements that are quite inflammatory about ending tenure in higher education. In February, Dan Patrick, the Lieutenant Governor of Texas, tweeted that it was time to end tenure at state universities in Texas. Florida has introduced, and I believe this week passed, legislation related to putting more constraints around tenure, and members of our Board of Trustees and BOG have stated their opinions, some of them, that they either oppose tenure or want to do a deep dive into it. Here at the Coalition for Carolina, we are all into deep dives, and we'd like to begin this one today with this conversation around tenure. Tenure is central to the functioning of the university, and that's our topic. It's embedded in the related but not identical concepts of academic freedom and First Amendment protections for free speech. In addition, tenure is threatened not just by sweeping legislation. There has been an erosion of tenure on campuses through tenure lines simply not being replaced when retirements occur. Instead, adjuncts or fixed-term faculty replace them at lower cost and without as much employment protection. I'll drop an article into the chat about that. To explore these and other questions, I'm joined by a really wonderful panel today. First is Professor Lloyd Kramer, a professor in the Department of History, a former chair of the Department of History, the director of the Carolina Public Humanities Program, and he is my immediate predecessor in the role of chair of the faculty. We are also joined by Professor Karin Pfennig, who, like everyone on this panel, started as an assistant professor and came through the tenure process. She began in 2004. She's now a full professor in the Department of Biology with a joint appointment in the Environment, Ecology, and Energy program at UNC. She and I met when we were both serving on the University Appointments, Promotions, and Tenure Committee, which she went on to chair. Professor Pat Parker is a professor in the Department of Communication and the director of the Institute for the Arts and Humanities. Professor Parker also arrived as an assistant professor in 1998, and she has served as chair of the Department of Communications and the director of the Graduate Certificate in Participatory Research. I'd like to start our conversation today with Professor Kramer, our historian, to ground us in how tenure came to be and to kind of set the stage for different aspects of this conversation. Professor Kramer.
Okay, thank you very much, Mimi. It's a pleasure to be here and to be part of this discussion. And I want to thank everybody who's joining us because it's a community that's going to explore these problems. My task here is to begin by giving us a little bit of historical perspective on how tenure came to be and why it was viewed as important. And in order to develop these themes, I want to share my screen just to provide a little historical perspective. And I hope everyone can see this at this point. The key starting point for tenure really came in the early 20th century. There had been attempts in earlier periods to talk about how to provide more security and stability for the faculty. But in the early 20th century, there were several high-profile firings of faculty, and there were other issues that emerged that led professors around the country to believe that it would be productive to the life of the mind and of the university to have a more stable system of tenure. And so the American Association of University Professors was founded in 1915. Two of the key leaders were Arthur Lovejoy, a professor at Johns Hopkins, and E.R.A. Seligman, who was a professor of economics at Columbia University. So to give us some perspective, I simply want to share the way that the academic freedom was defined by the AAUP when they came up with a formal statement. First, they had a statement during World War I, and then they came up with a more formal statement in 1940. Academic freedom, and this is why it's so important and how it's connected to tenure. According to this definition, academic freedom means teachers are entitled to full freedom in research and in the publication of the results, subject to the adequate performance of their other academic duties. But research for pecuniary return should be based upon an understanding with the authorities of the institution. So if you, for example, do research for a pharmaceutical company or for some private business, that's a little different, and you have to make another arrangement. But other research is part of your academic duty. Secondly, teachers are entitled to freedom in the classroom in discussing their subject, but they should be careful not to introduce into their teaching controversial matter which has no relation to their subject. So for example, if you're teaching chemistry, for example, if day after day you were talking about the political history of Brazil, perhaps, it wouldn't be deemed to be a relevant subject. So you do have some obligation to address the subject of your course. But within that, you're free to develop your syllabi, to choose your assignments, to set the whole curriculum is in the hands of the faculty, and that is essential for academic freedom. And then the third issue is that college and university teachers are citizens, members of a learned profession, and also officers of an educational institution. So when they speak or write as citizens, they should be free from institutional censorship or discipline. That is, faculty do not lose their First Amendment rights. They are free to talk about any public issue they want, but they should remember that they have a special position. They should remember that the public may judge their profession and their institution by their utterances. They should at all times be accurate, should exercise appropriate restraint, and show respect for the opinions of others, and make every effort to indicate that they are not speaking for the institution. So, for example, you can't claim to be speaking for the University of North Carolina if you make a pronouncement about a political candidate, but you certainly have the right to make such pronouncements in the public sphere. But let me just draw one important distinction here between academic freedom and free speech. Because academic freedom means you are free to pursue research and to publish the results no matter where that research may lead. But it presumes a certain rigor and commitment to methodologies, using evidence, having careful research. So, for example, and to take an example in my field of history, someone may become a Holocaust denier. They may say the Holocaust never happened. This would be a blatant historical lie. And as a matter of free speech, they could presumably go into the public square and make such a speech in Raleigh or somewhere. But if they came up for tenure and they claimed the Holocaust did not happen, academic freedom does not mean they would then be rewarded for making those statements and be promoted to full professor or to tenure. Tenure assumes a rigorous professional evaluation of truth claims. And that's where academic freedom is not exactly the same as free speech, although free speech is protected by academic freedom, free speech in the public sphere. So I want to, now I want to try to go, whoops, my screen sharing has stopped, so I'm going to do this again. I want to explain two important cases in which the issue of academic freedom was denied, but in each of these cases, it had to do with people making statements in the public sphere. And this is why tenure became so important to academics. There was a famous case in 1900 at Stanford where a sociologist named Edward Ross was fired at the request of the main trustee, Jane Stanford, the wife of the founder of the university, after Ross made public comments opposing Chinese immigration and favoring public ownership of utilities. And both of these ideas were deemed to be socialist at the time because they were positions held by labor unions. The president of the university fired Ross. He lost his job. The second famous case, James Cattell and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow Dana, were both fired at Columbia University in 1917 for writing and speaking against US involvement and policies in World War I. These are examples that aroused enormous outcry among faculty because people were speaking in the public square and they were losing their job within the university. And I want to give one other example, and it has to do with UNC Chapel Hill, and it's especially relevant, I think, because we know the history of our own university. This is an account of what happened in 1856 during the lead up to the US presidential election. An attack was made in the local press on an unidentified professor whose name was Benjamin Hedrick, who allegedly supported the anti-slavery candidate John C. Fremont, the Republican. And the Raleigh Standard, the newspaper, said this would lead to a disaster, a separation of the states. And this was the quote: "Let our schools and seminaries of learning be scrutinized, and if Black Republicans, i.e. Fremont supporters, are found in them, let them be driven out. That man is neither a fit nor a safe instructor of our young men who even inclines to Fremont and Black Republicanism." And I mention this issue because it's sort of what we hear today about, well, people who teach the 1619 Project or critical race theory should not be allowed to teach in our schools. What if this happened at the university? This is what happened in 1856. In this same newspaper, shortly afterwards, a letter to the editor appeared from someone calling himself an alumnus of UNC, who said, "Can the trustees of our own state university invite pupils to this institution under their charge with the assurance that this mainstream of education contains no deadly poison at its fountainhead? We have been reliably informed that a professor at our state university," this man Hedrick, "is an open and avowed supporter of Fremont and declares his willingness, nay, his desire, to support the Black Republican ticket. Is he a fit or safe instructor for our young men? Ought he not be required to leave, at least dismissed from a situation where his poisonous influence is so powerful and his teaching so antagonist to the honor and society of the university and the state? We must have security that at state universities we will have no cankerworm preying at the very vitals of Southern institutions." And what happened? The newspaper immediately said, this is like Fox News in 1856, "We take it for granted that Professor Hedrick will be promptly removed." And the next week, the faculty disowned him, the parents threatened to withdraw their sons, alumni joined the public in calling for his dismissal. He refused to resign, and he was terminated within a week, though his salary was paid to the end of the term. The only faculty member to defend him was a French instructor named Henri Harris, who was also terminated immediately at the same time. Hounded by a mob, Hedrick left his native state. So I have shared these historical examples because I want to suggest that tenure came about for two important reasons. Number one, to protect the security and freedom of people to present whatever they believe to be the truth based on careful evidence in their classrooms and in their research. And secondly, to prevent trustees from arbitrarily firing any member of the faculty who exercise free speech rights outside the university. And I hope we can come back to each of these issues.
Lloyd, thank you. It is always grounding to hear about that really so much of what we face, there's really nothing new under the sun, that it comes around in different times and in different phases and in different flavors. So very useful to have those examples to ground us. But before we sort of move into another direction, is there anything, Karin or Pat, that you'd like to respond to in what Lloyd has said?
Well, First of all, thank you to the coalition for convening this panel and on this very important and timely topic. And thank you to Lloyd for, as usual, giving us a really wonderful historical context for this issue. You know, I think one of the things that I would like to add is that nuance, not so much of a nuance, like sort of the foundation here of the importance of academic rigor to the tenure, the idea of tenure. So in other words, the fact that faculty are protected to present their ideas, the accurate ideas with evidence and so forth. And that's at the foundation of rigor, and so much related to other foundations of the academy, with regard to that, which in terms of peer review, a strong interdisciplinary, or rather disciplinary tie. I mean, I think I saw a reference in there to faculty being, it's assumed that you're a part of a learned society or profession. So each of our disciplines has our professional associations, also made up of our peers and other faculty that help to establish those, rigorous disciplinary standards by which we judge our research and present our research, and that forms the basis of tenure. So I think that is so important to our discussion to emphasize that grounded in this is this idea of academic rigor, and tenure protects the integrity of academic rigor.
I think that's a great segue, Pat, to ask Karin, who has been in this role as chair of the Appointments, Promotions, and Tenure Committee. Karin, if you could give us an overview of the tenure process, how it begins, how someone moves through that, and maybe if there are alternative ways that sometimes people come into the university through the versus the more typical process. And I'll just say to our audience, we are talking about UNC's specific process here at Chapel Hill. It is much like others around the country, although each university may vary a bit in terms of their timeframes and their very specific procedures. So, but we're going to try and kind of keep this at a higher level. So, Karin.
Right. So the way tenure works at an institution like UNC is that it really begins in the candidates department, where the members of their department perform a rigorous evaluation of that person's work that they have conducted from the time they arrive at the institution through the period of time that they come up and are considered for tenure. Usually it's about 4 or 5 years if you come as a beginning assistant professor. And part of that rigorous evaluation comes in terms of evaluating the person's teaching and their contributions to the classroom, their contributions to service and how they have served the university community, as well as the broader community here in North Carolina. And then importantly, it evaluates the candidate's scholarship. And the way that is done is not just by a person's peers in their particular department, but we solicit letters from what we call outside experts from our institution to evaluate that candidate and determine whether their scholarship is deemed worthy of tenure and basically keeping the person here at the institution. And when we go out and solicit those external letter writers to evaluate that, these people are senior people in their field. They are people who are not, they're considered independent evaluators. They can't be people who have personal relationships or connections. They have to be essentially strangers in a sense, that they don't have any sort of personal connection to the candidate that might in any way bias their ability to evaluate the person's scholarship on its own merits. And that's a really important component because, imagine being in any sort of position outside of the academic realm and having 4 strangers be approached to evaluate whether or not you are good at your job. That's essentially what the tenure process entails. And those people are not just anybody. They are usually, we require that those letter writers come from people who are at higher ranks, so people who have already achieved the rank of tenured professor or somebody who's a full professor. They have to be at peer institutions, so institutions that are on the level of UNC or above, or who are in programs that certainly match UNC in terms of its caliber in your particular area. And basically they evaluate whether or not the candidate is somebody who has established a national or international reputation, who is basically somebody who is on their way to becoming a world leader in their particular area of research. And again, imagining what that looks like, if you imagine any other walk of life, to think of people writing letters of recommendation who are total strangers and saying, you are the best in the world at what you do. That is essentially what tenure entails. And so all of that material comes back to the department. The department and members who already have received tenure will evaluate the materials that come in, and they are the sort of the first pass. They take a vote of whether or not you should receive tenure in that department. And then from there, it goes on up to higher levels where that candidate's materials and all of the previous levels are evaluated in light of the earlier level, until it gets all the way to the APT, the Appointment, Promotion, and Tenure Committee. And at that point, we review everything, and we also take a vote on whether or not this person should receive tenure or not. And that is a recommendation. We don't actually, our vote is not binding. We make a recommendation to the provost's office, and the provost has the final say of whether or not a candidate is given tenure here at the institution. But they then put that forward to the Board of Trustees and then onward to the Board of Governors. So as we have been emphasizing, it is a very rigorous process. It's a very a long-term and time-consuming process. The people involved take the conferral of tenure very seriously. It's an important decision for the candidate, because if you do not receive tenure, you are dismissed from the university. If you do receive tenure, you have, we'll talk about this, protection and job security. And that's something that fellow faculty take seriously about the conferral of tenure and what the ramifications are for the institution, but also for the person who might be denied or receive tenure. So that's kind of an overview, and I don't know if maybe I skipped some of the key elements there. And I talked about it as somebody who goes from the beginning. Tenure can be obtained by people who maybe they already had tenure at another institution, and they come and are hired at UNC. They still have to go through that process again to determine whether or not they should receive tenure here at UNC, even though they may have already received tenure at that other institution. So again, there are no shortcuts that get taken whenever we make a determination of conferring tenure here.
Thanks, Karin. That's very helpful. I wanted to just add a couple of things, and that is sort of what the candidate themselves, what they have to put forward to start the whole process rolling. Just putting that tenure packet together where they write an extensive personal statement about their research, their teaching, their scholarship, and their service. Those can be, often 10, 15 pages long, where they are explaining their work, the importance of their work. They are sending out a selected group of their publications that go along with that. So that, I mean, I remember mine was a huge notebook, that now all of this is electronic, but it was a very, very thick notebooks that go forward, so that's the starting point, and then going through. So the candidate themselves also has to go through a pretty deep kind of self-evaluation, if you will. We have a question in the Q&A that's asking what percentage of professors who are evaluated for tenure at UNC receive the designation. And I don't know the answer to that question offhand. I will say that I think it's probably high, but that's because there's another valve before you ever get to the tenure question. And that is the third year review. So after you have been here for 3 years, there is a review at that point. And institutions vary, I think, in this domain. Some people don't mind kind of stringing people along. I think it has been the tradition at UNC that if someone is not performing well and it doesn't look like they're going to receive tenure or be able to get there by that 5 or 6 year mark, that they are cut loose at that point. They are not reappointed. And so in answer to that question, I think you would have to think about that high retention rate in the context of also the rigorous hiring process, and then that third year review being a place where people that probably aren't going to be competitive for tenure are given the opportunity to leave without having been turned down for tenure.
Well, I think that's a really important point, Mimi, and to go further, even beyond the third year review, the tenure process, as you highlighted, it's a very demanding, it's frankly an emotionally draining process. Whereas an assistant professor, you come in and you work very, you're focused on this life altering decision, right? And for people who come into that are often self-aware of or whether or not they are making the strides that are necessary to achieve tenure. And it's often the case that people who are not succeeding move on before you get to that point. And so what we do see is a very high rate of at the level of the APT of tenure being conferred. But what you don't see in those statistics is that, first of all, departments that vote no, those packages don't even make it up to the higher levels. The candidate is dismissed at that point, as in the third year reviews. And many people move on because the whole process itself is so demanding that they often go elsewhere before they even come up to those points.
Thank you. I was also just going to ask Karin about the appointments, promotions, and tenure committee. That is an elected committee of full professors from across the university. But how would you say, in your experience, how do people approach that work? I mean, how often does it meet? As I remember, it was a pretty demanding committee.
Right. So the committee meets every month of the year. We meet once a month, and we review all of these. We call them dossiers. These candidate compilations of all of their materials that are coming in from across the university. And one of the things that has been a real pleasure and really remarkable is, maybe not remarkable, is how seriously the people on the committee take their work, and how I don't want to say solemn is not maybe quite the right word, but the deliberations are, in terms of really, on the one hand, wanting to ensure that if there are potential issues, that we understand the stakes that that these decisions are taking, in terms of what it means, again, for the university, but also what it means in terms of, life-altering decisions for the individuals who are coming before the committee. And so these are not trivial decisions, and they're not treated as such. We spend a great deal of time talking about those individual candidates, but also talking about the nature of what it means to confer tenure more generally, what that looks like. Is it being applied fairly across the university? Because we are, none of us are necessarily expert in any particular area of a candidate who might come before us. So we cannot necessarily evaluate the value of, I'm a biologist. I cannot necessarily evaluate directly the scholarship that comes from somebody in the history department. But at the same time, I still have to evaluate those external letters, the comments from that person's colleagues, and try to understand what the case for tenure is in that particular situation. And so we have conversations about how do we make those decisions and come to them. So the conversations are often, they can, I don't want to say heated, but they are lively. They are certainly respectful, and certainly they come from people. One of the things I should highlight is that the APT is an elected committee. So the members are elected from the faculty, and there are different representatives that are apportioned from different parts of the university. So we come with a diverse set of perspectives on how tenure works at our particular department level, our particular units, and that informs the discussion and keeps it very robust in terms of that decision-making process.
Thank you. Pat, you've had a role as the department chair in addition to your role as director of the IAH right now, where these decisions come into your work quite regularly. The IAH you've described it as a sure place for faculty, a place where faculty can really develop their scholarship, but then also you're often involved in recruitment and retention through that role. And then as a department chair, you've seen many tenure cases. What's your perspective on all of this?
Well, one way that I can approach your question, Mimi, is to talk about, which is the subject of this panel, the importance of tenure to the university. I mean, we are the oldest public university. We've earned an elite status among our peers, not just the big publics, but among some of the privates. And so in many ways, we are a leader in academic, these standards of academic rigor and in thinking about research and so many areas where we're leading. And so to say that tenure could even be threatened, but let alone taken away, I think would jeopardize, quite frankly, it could jeopardize our accreditation, as a university. But also, I just don't see how we could, recruit and retain the world-class faculty that we have here. I mean, we are expected to be leaders, and we have an obligation to uphold those standards. And so I think it's incredibly important, having this conversation, asserting, and I know that in any sector of our university, I think this conversation could be happening in terms of understanding how integral tenure is to our stature as a leading global public research university. And I think, it's just very, I guess I'll just end with that. It's critical to be able to recruit and retain our world-class faculty, because we're a leader in public in the academy.
Lloyd, do you want to join in? Anything that you want to pick up on?
Actually, I wanted to respond just briefly to comments that both Karin and Pat have made. I wanted to point out one other way in which there is a long journey toward tenure, and it starts at the beginning of graduate school, so that already people have been weeded out getting into graduate school, then getting through their comprehensive exams, then finishing their dissertation, then applying for jobs. So even when we hire someone in our department, for example, there may be 100 applicants. So the tenure rate is pretty high, but then the people who've reached that point have come through an incredible journey of 10 to 15 years before they get there. But I want to also pick up on Pat's point about what this means to the university, because I think that tenure is often portrayed as something that has to do with individuals, and that is true. I mean, there is some individual security that one has some certainty about professional continuity and having a job, and that's important for one's well-being. But one of the things that gets overlooked in our society, I think, and even in this debate about tenure, is that something that benefits these individuals also has great importance for the common good. And what that means is that people make a commitment to be part of an institution. The institution makes the commitment to those people. And like all healthy, enduring relationships, it requires a level of trust and commitment. And if one lives in an institution where every year some percentage of the people are just fired or let go or dismissed or ignored, the health of that institution breaks down. And certainly the community breaks down. And no one, I think, would want to be in a church or a club or a family where people are simply thrown away, because they're no longer needed. And it is a matter of a mutual commitment. And the faculty stay here year after year because they are committed to UNC. But on the other hand, UNC is committed to those faculty. And let's say this could be the beginning of a beautiful relationship. Every time it happens, it is an affirmation. I'm not saying it's exactly like a marriage, because marriages break up and so do tenure relations. But it goes on. It's not just a fly-by-night, brief little relationship. It's a commitment. And that affects the health of the community. And let me just make one other point about the common good. I'll be historical about this again. One of the most common characteristics of authoritarian societies is that when teachers or faculty go against some reigning ideological or political position, they are dismissed. They are removed, as we saw with the case of Professor Hedrick at UNC in 1856. He didn't go along with slavery, he was fired. And so just as we don't fire judges every year or say judges shouldn't stay in their position, we assume that democracy, the functioning of our system, requires continuity and people who are in a long-term position. And I'm not saying that tenured faculty are like judges, but they are in some sense, in that they shouldn't be vulnerable to every passing wind or current of political pressure, economic downturn. So the common good for the university as a whole and for the society, which needs independent, creative people who are securely positioned, both of these elements of the common good are served by a tenure system that also helps individuals have more stable lives and careers. And I would stress both sides of that process.
Well, I guess following up on that, one of the things I would highlight about the process and how the people who get to that, amplifying on what you're saying, is that there isn't as we talk about the process, there's no clear checkbox, right? That part of what happens with academic freedom, it's both a blessing and a curse, in the sense that there is no set deadlines or pathways to tenure. The people who come
Karin,
find, am I?
I think you were frozen for a moment.
I was frozen. Oh, okay.
Okay.
Sorry. But I was saying that the people are entirely self-motivated to make a contribution, to contribute to their field and to the institution, to build those relationships. And that self-drive and that self-motivation is something that it doesn't stop as soon as you get tenure. It's part of an ongoing relationship of people who are driven to contribute in ways that it's hard to describe how passionate people are about their particular areas and subjects, and they bring that to the community, and that's what tenure it reinforces, right? Is that kind of passion and drive.
We have a question that is bringing up a particular situation, Charles Murray. And I know Charles Murray's work, or his books, but I don't necessarily know about his tenure situation. And academic rigor is subject to controversy with the conclusions. And we see this with Charles Murray as an example. And the question is, how is such controversy resolved in the tenure process? Does anybody want to take a stab at that? I can, or maybe John, if you want to tell us a little more about your specific example, that might be helpful. But I guess I would just put out there that I think a lot of the focus in the evaluation of tenure is on the process of how somebody gets to their conclusions, the methods that they use, the standards by which they collect data or analyze data, and interpret the data that they find. Is that being done in accordance with the standards of the discipline? But I'll let other people jump in. Yeah.
Well, I was going to go in that same direction, Mimi. As was pointed out at the beginning, the Office of the Provost is responsible for setting the tenure guidelines. I believe we made that point. This may have been our conversation beforehand. But those are determined through a process that is grounded in the respective disciplines. So we know that at the level of the provost, there are various pathways to discipline, or rather to tenure, that correspond to different disciplines. So in my department, in the Department of Communication, we have the good fortune of being a very interdisciplinary department. And so we have artists, we have people who are makers, who are performers, we have people who use historical methodologies, who write books, so the point being, when we're sitting around the table evaluating a tenure case, we rely on the experts in those fields. And so, the subjectivity is worked out in each of the disciplines. And yes, there are controversy, but I think even across disciplines, there's this idea of interrogation of ideas and trial and error. I mean, how many scientific facts have been discovered to be expanded later on with new knowledge, but you use the tools that you have at your disposal in a particular moment. And the same thing with, I think, with historical analysis, you have the context. So I think the person who asked the question brings up a very important point. The fact that evaluation is subjective. And so the best we can do is to have a rigorous process, to guide our evaluation.
Could I follow up on that point? I think that Charles Murray, I assume this is the person who has written about in IQ tests and the question of race and whether there's racism involved in how these processes have been described. And I don't know the details of this. It's certainly beyond my specific knowledge, but I do know that there is inevitably some way of understanding what is considered viable or truthful or legitimate at one period of time, which is not accepted at another time. And this is a complicated problem about how one makes the case that this is an advance of knowledge, or is this something that's completely off the rails, or does this claim have basis in some kind of rigorous methodology? And, you know, I could come back to my own field again. There was a, you know, in the history of the Civil War, there was a long running school called the Dunning School, which basically said, well, the Civil War wasn't about slavery, it was about states' rights or something. And then a whole lot of people got positions making that argument. And then the argument changed, because then there was a much more emphasis on the role of slavery and on other issues. So I wouldn't say that tenure confirms an absolute and enduring truth. What it defends is, at any given time, the most respected experts in a field carefully and rigorously evaluate the methods and claims that a scholar is making. And inevitably, because knowledge is not stagnant, inevitably what may be regarded as true or legitimate in one period shifts as the paradigms of knowledge evolve. And tenure should not prevent that evolution of knowledge and truth, but it should not be afraid of holding to certain standards at the same time. So I don't know. I don't want to get into the Murray case in specifics, but I do know that it's never totally simple or cut and dried. But it depends on trust and the best faith effort that people make to assess the legitimacy of a person's work.
I think, I mean, just my quick search here while we've been talking, I do not find that he was denied tenure. He is a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. So to my knowledge, he has never been through, from what I can see, he hasn't been through a tenure process. He was criticized at a lecture at Harvard recently for his books, and things were criticized by the faculty at Harvard, but that would be, something completely different than a tenure process.
I know there have been many controversial speakers like Charles Murray, but I don't know if he ever had tenure at an academic university. But
yeah, I don't see that. I can't see that in a quick search if that's the case.
But still, I mean, people with his point of view no doubt were tenured at certain points in the past for claims that would now be regarded as highly problematic.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Let's see.
Mimi, did you see the comment? There was one other Q&A in the chat that you may have missed. Someone who invites us to David Pardue, who invites us to make the business case for tenure.
Yeah. Thank you for calling that to my attention, Pat. And I mean, that is a great business case. I think it does promote loyalty, as I think Lloyd has pointed out, toward an institution and toward a set of ideals. I mean, I think we've seen this over the last several years at our university, where people have really struggled and wondered sometimes whether this is the right place for them, and yet at the same time are deeply invested here, and that makes a difference, and it gives us a chance to right the ship if it's off course.
So I think the business case is very interesting, because let's imagine you were running an enterprise, a business, and what you want in your employees at least two, maybe three essential characteristics. One, you want them to feel that they have some security and stability to be able to come up with new ideas and not be at risk of losing a job just because they're being innovative. In fact, you want to encourage that, like think outside the box, and then maybe that'll lead us in a new direction. And secondly, you want some stability in your workforce. You don't want to have to go out and hire a whole new team of people all the time.
Mhm.
And thirdly, a business, like any other community of people, needs a sense of social coherence, a sense of people who are committed to being part of that business and aren't just all the time thinking, I got to get out of here. I got to get out of here. That is economically self-defeating for a business. So I would absolutely agree that what we're talking about, a smart business encourages many of the characteristics that a university encourages in a tenured faculty.
I think with these last 10 minutes, it might be useful to turn our attention to, the kinds of threats that we have been talking about or mentioning to tenure are the big dramatic ones that make the headlines. But there is this other trend of simply, when someone vacates a tenure line for whatever reason, because they retire, because they go to another university, that tenure line is not necessarily replaced within a department, or it is replaced with a series of adjunct instructors or with fixed term faculty. And I think this is becoming this is a critical sort of issue on our campus and on many campuses, because we do have many now fixed term faculty who behave in many ways and contribute in many ways as tenured faculty. And yet they have none of the same job security. They don't necessarily feel as protected in the exploration of their ideas. And it creates an internal tension within the university that I think is very challenging. What do you all think?
I think, I didn't mute myself before, so I'll go ahead and speak. I was going to speak anyway. I think you're absolutely right. In pointing out that there is just sort of this subtle erosion of, the number of tenured faculty just through attrition in that way. I think with any institution, like all institutions, we have to adapt. There are systems that are changing, and I think we have to look at what has given rise to more fixed term faculty being appointed and fewer tenure track. Is it it seems to me that the bottom line is that there's this erosion that's happening, and that there aren't these other forces. And I think that there needs to be conversations around like this, around the value of tenure, and is this are we getting to the point of eroding our the very foundations of our academic enterprise here?
Yeah. Maybe I want to bring in one more thing, a slightly different topic, just for our audience, to make sure that people know that tenure, every once in a while you hear people make statements like, tenure protects bad actors in one way or another. And while no system is perfect in that regard, I think it's important for people to know that there are processes that remove tenure from individuals if behavior is extreme, if there is, really very difficult some very difficult situations that are going on for which that professor is responsible, that there is a process there. UNC has a process of 5-year review. Every 5 years, tenured faculty have to put forward essentially the same thing that they had to put forward for tenure, which is a packet that explains where they are in their scholarship and where they're moving. This is something that has caused outcry in a couple of other states in recent years. I think they put this kind of a structure in at Georgia. That has been in existence at UNC for what, probably 10 or 15 years at least, I would say. So those 2 points, anything else that you all feel like is particularly important for our audience to know or to think about right now?
I wanted to come back to the issue of adjuncts and the argument that people make that why should faculty have tenure because people in other businesses don't have tenure. They can be fired and let go at any point. And in fact, in many companies, there's a move toward temporary workers, not people with long-term relations to the company with the benefits that go with that. I happen to think that that is undermining the health and vitality of many companies as well as other kinds of institutions. There was the old idea of the Japanese model where people would work for a business and they knew they could be there their whole lives. And maybe there was some, as they say, dead wood, but there was a kind of sense of a mutual commitment. And I think inevitably there are going to be more and more temporary workers in different parts of our economy and in the university. But I don't think that we should take that as a model for how a healthy and vibrant community flourishes, either in the corporate sphere or in the university sphere. That commitments make a difference, and we have to think about how the university can make those commitments to its staff and to its faculty.
And I think that's a really important point, especially as we think about not just the research and scholarship mission of the university, but also in terms of the teaching and training of the next generation of scholars. Tenure provides academic freedom to individual faculty, but it also means that those individual faculty can train the next generation in their particular field. The undergraduates today can come and work with us on new ideas, novel things that we might not otherwise feel comfortable or free to do if we did not have tenure, right? That academic freedom becomes an umbrella, not just for the individual, but the people who they are training as well. And I think that as a result, it benefits our mission in education, not just our mission in scholarship. As a consequence of that.
Well, thank you. I want to thank this great panel. It is wonderful to talk with you all this afternoon, and thank you all who have attended. I'm dropping the link to the Coalition for Carolina in the chat. We hope that if you haven't already, you'll join us, sign up for our newsletters, follow us on social media. We want to keep our university strong and healthy and a force for good in North Carolina. And we want to have conversations like this. Every business, every institution has its sort of arcane, maybe, ways of working, and it helps all of us to understand how our institutions work. So we hope you'll join us for future webinars and interviews. Thank you, Professor Kramer, Professor Parker, and Professor Pfennig for being here today. Bye, everybody.